Welcome to chapter 14. This is actually the second time I'm trying to upload this. I've had some technical issues, so I apologize for the delay in getting this posted, but I actually thought it had been previously posted, and I realized that there was a technical problem with the software, so I'm going to have to re-record my lectures. This is chapter 14, contractual capacity. Very, very important concept. As I was mentioning, very important concept because without contractual capacity, you do not have a valid contract. Remember, there are three types of contracts that we have. We have valid, we have voidable, and we have void. So contractual capacity is one of the required elements in order for you to actually have a contract. Without that, there is no contract. This is a pretty short chapter, pretty straightforward. So I'm hoping it doesn't give anyone much trouble. Remember, next week we have the exam. So next week we have exam 2. Make sure you bring your Scantron. Make sure you're prepared for that. So what are we going to talk about in this chapter? Well, we're going to talk about the contractual capacity of minors, incompetent persons, and intoxicated persons. Each of those obviously is treated a little bit differently. Let's start off with minors. So what is a minor? Because that's key. We have to start in the very beginning and talk about the definition. A minor is simply a person who's under the age of majority, which is usually 18 years of age. So anybody in Florida in particular under the age of 18 would be considered a minor, and minors do not have the capacity to contract. So in other words, if you enter into a contract with a minor, you may or may not have a contract, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about here. So let's move on to that concept, liability on contracts. A minor's contracts are voidable at the minor's option. So in other words, remember that distinction between valid, void, and voidable. Voidable means that one of the parties has the option to either accept or affirm or ratify the contract or disaffirm. In other words, if the party says there is no contract, then in essence, there is no contract. And that's true of minors. Minors have the choice. So if you enter into a contract with a minor, automatically that contract is voidable. And what that means is that the minor gets to decide if there is a valid contract or if there is no contract at all. And so that is a very important factor. So for example, let's say I like a car that a minor owns. So I make an offer on the car to buy the car, and the minor says, sure, we enter into a written agreement, and the day of closing comes when I'm supposed to transfer the funds, and the minor is supposed to transfer title to the car over to me. I show up, I have the funds, and the minor says, nope, sorry, I'm not, I like the car, I'm not going to sell it to you. At that point, there's absolutely nothing that you can do because that contract is voidable by the minor. And if the minor chooses not to pursue the contract, or in other words, disaffirms the contract, then you don't have a contract at all. So you have to be very, very careful when you're dealing with minors. Now, the minor can ratify the contract if the minor wants to. So in other words, remember, the choice is with the minor. So the minor decides. They either ratify the contract, meaning they accept the terms. So in my example, if the minor sells me the car, then that's fine. Then that's a valid contract. It's done, no problem. But don't forget that the minor has the option of voiding the contract or disaffirming the contract, in which case you do not have a contract to begin with. The only exception to that is liabilities for what the slide here calls necessaries or necessities of life. A minor is liable for the reasonable value of necessary items, those that reasonably supply a person's needs. So for example, toiletries or clothes or the like. There's an argument that all of those are necessaries, and therefore that contract, even though you enter into a contract with a minor, they're going to be liable for the reasonable value of those necessary items. But that's really the only exception as it pertains to minors. What about if a minor makes a misrepresentation of their age? So in other words, you're going to sell the car, or I'm sorry, you're going to buy the car. You have your doubt about the minor's age, and the minor says, yeah, I'm 18. So the minor actually lied about their age. Well, the prevailing view is that a minor may disaffirm the contract anyway. So, whether the minor tells you the truth about their age or not, doesn't matter. Really, the law is only looking at the fact is, are you dealing with a minor or not? It doesn't matter what the minor tells you, right? Just because I tell you I'm 40 doesn't mean I'm 26 or 60, right? I can tell you whatever I want. It doesn't change the fact that my age is less than 18. And so really, that's what this means. As a matter of public policy, even if the minor lies, he's still a minor, and therefore that contract is still voidable. In other words, the minor has the option to proceed with the contract or disaffirm it. What about liability for a tort connected with a contract? If a tort and a contract are so intertwined that to enforce the tort, the court must enforce the contract, then the minor is not liable in tort either. An example of that would be a negligent misrepresentation, for example. And let's say that that's part of the contract. Let's say you enter into a contract with a minor, and there is a negligent misrepresentation that the minor made as part of that contract. Well, obviously the contract's not going to be enforceable. We already talked about that. But, the negligent misrepresentation may be a complete and separate tort. But if it's intertwined with a contract, in other words, if it goes to one of the terms of the contract, then that tort is also not actionable. So in other words, you cannot sue the minor for the tort. So in that type of situation, you lose both claims, really. You lose the claim on the contract and you lose the claim on the tort. What about incompetent and intoxicated people? Well, the law makes a small distinction between people that are under guardianship and those that are not. What do we mean by people under guardianship? What that means is that the person is so incapacitated that they cannot make their own decisions or really understand what's going on. And so the court appoints a guardian to protect their interests and to make decisions for them. So contracts made by a person placed under guardianship by court order are void. So in other words, most guardians are appointed by the court, and that's what we mean by court order, or appointed by court order. So any contract that you enter into with a person that is under guardianship is going to be void, meaning you never had a contract to begin with, which really kind of makes sense, right? Because if the person is so incompetent that a guardian needs to be appointed to make decisions for them because they can't, they're not well enough mentally to understand and make their own decisions, then how can they enter into a contract? They can't. So that's almost a pretty obvious one there. The next one is mental illness or defect. A contract entered into by a mentally incompetent person, one who's unable to understand the nature and consequences of his acts, is voidable. So there's a difference between this and the person under guardianship, right? Under guardianship, the contract is void, meaning you never had a contract. Under this particular circumstance where the person has mental illness and can't understand what's going on, but a guardian has not been appointed, then the standard is a little bit lower. And so the standard is that the contract is voidable. So in other words, the person that is incompetent gets to decide whether there's a contract or not. So if they decide that there is a contract, then the contract will be valid. If the person decides that there is no contract or doesn't want to proceed with the contract, then that contract will be deemed to be void. And so therefore that's the same as if there had never been a contract to begin with. So that's the difference between somebody under guardianship and somebody that is just simply incompetent and has mental illness, but is not under guardianship. What about intoxicated people? Because a contract entered into by an intoxicated person, again, one who cannot understand the nature and consequences of actions, again, is voidable. So it's not going to be void, but it's going to be voidable. So in other words, if somebody's intoxicated, and there is a difference between mental incompetence, for example, and or mental illness and intoxication. For the most part, if you're incompetent, for example, you have Alzheimer's or dementia, that's not curable, and it actually gets progressively worse. That's different than intoxication. Intoxication, no matter how intoxicated you are, is temporary. Sooner or later, the effects of the alcohol wear off and you come back to your senses. And so that contract is voidable. So in other words, the intoxicated person gets to decide whether there is a valid contract or a void contract, meaning you didn't have a contract to begin with. Now, obviously, the court is going to look at a bunch of different factors. One of those is how intoxicated was the person really. Another factor that's going to be looked at is, did the other person somehow coerce or trick you or take advantage of the fact that you were intoxicated so that they could get you to enter into a contract, in particular, that had terms that were unfavorable to you. Those things are going to be looked at very unfavorably by the court, and that type of contract is likely to be deemed to be void, so that you never had a contract to begin with. So again, all of those distinctions are important. Also, what's important there is really we're going to look to the person. If the person, for whatever reason, whether it's intoxication, whether it's incompetence, but if the person cannot understand the nature and consequences of their actions, then obviously we cannot hold them liable for a contract or an agreement that they made that they may not even recall making or that they don't understand. So those are the types of things that the law is trying to address and trying to prevent abuse of the situation and of those people. The last slide that I'm going to show you here is actually in your book, but it talks about, really it's a scale when we're talking about incapacity. So again, we're talking about minors, we're talking about non-adjudicated incompetence, and also those that are intoxicated. So in certain circumstances, incapacity does not last forever. And that's also, that's very much true with intoxication. There's going to come a point that even though you may be intoxicated now, and even though you may not have contractual capacity now, later, once you recover, then you will regain that contractual capacity. So in other words, the incapacity terminates. And that's what this slide talks about. It talks about when somebody has incapacity on one end of the scale, and on the other when they have full capacity. And then it also talks about the different types of contracts and whether they can be ratified or disaffirmed. If there are no questions, I'm going to move on to the next chapter. Again, this was a very short, very straightforward chapter. Please let me know if you have any questions. In particular, again, don't forget we have exam 2, so make sure you're ready for that.